Good morning, everybody. I'm Don Stewart, and welcome to another edition of Breaking News. Today is Wednesday. It is the 19th day of November, 2025. And in the headlines this morning, it appears that the worry of a potential Palestinian state, as well as the selling of F-35s to the Saudis, is not as problematic as it seems on the surface. Now, what we're going to do is summarize the recent headlines to try and put all these complicated stories into perspective. And it is complicated. As we mentioned yesterday, Danny Danon, Israel's ambassador to the UN, said that. It's a whole bunch of complicated issues. So we'll try and summarize them for you to tell you where we're at right now. Okay. So basically, three things we want to get across. First of all, we mentioned this yesterday. The approved International Stabilization Force is not connected with the UN, so Israel's hands are not tied. It is an American project here to get rid of Hamas. It has nothing to do with the United Nations, even though certain Arab states wanted the UN to have some say so. That's the good news about that. And then the Saudi offer and the price it will pay. This is a story from Israel Hayom. It kind of lists what the Saudis are offering and what Israel will have to pay to get normalization there, or at least some type of recognition from the Saudis. And then we have another story that we put together. The Palestinian state worries are offset by other factors. We're going to explain that. So it's not as big a deal as it seems. So on the surface now, what we seem to have is Trump's plan going forward, but there are complications. We'll explain what's taking place. So at least you will have a good understanding of what's taking place. So we're piecing together two recent stories from the website Israel Hayom in our summary here, and hopefully it will make sense. All right. Our first headline, number one, the approved International Stabilization Force is not connected with the United Nations. This is, in other words, Israel's hands are not tied. We want to get that across. From yesterday's stories with Israel's ambassador Danny Danon, while the Trump plan received UN recognition of its International Stabilization Force, the ISF, the UN will have no say-so in what they do, despite the attempts of some Arab Muslim nations to give them some type of power. They have none. It's a total American thing. With Donald Trump is the one who's the head and in charge of all this. So it's an American project with Trump in charge as they try to recruit nations to have their soldiers in Gaza as a peacekeeping force. And of course, we know what the problem is. No nation wants to put their soldiers in harm's way with a fully militarized Hamas. So the issue is somehow getting the weapons out of the hands of Hamas. At the end of the day, like we said, it most likely will be Israel that does this. Now, remember the story we did the other day. Hamas is also not only, rearming itself in Gaza, it's stockpiling more heavier weapons in other countries. Yemen and a few other countries are stockpiling weapons in some of the countries that are, working with Hamas. And so Hamas's goal is not any way, shape, or form over. They want to stay in Gaza. They want to rearm. They want to recruit, and they want to do this all over again. So this is the situation, the worry. So we also have this. This is from Israel Hayom. The administration previously guaranteed it wouldn't restrict Israelis' military actions against Hamas should the organization breach the ceasefire. The U.S. additionally pledged not to constrain Israel if Hamas declines disarmament, maintains weapons buildup while constituting a threat. Israel could restart the war for Hamas dismantlement contingent upon American coordination. And so that's where we're at. They could go back and fight again. Obviously, they don't want to, but it seems they may not have any choice. In some, Israel's hands are not tied. They will be able to disarm Hamas if Hamas continues to refuse to give up their weapons. And again, this is in coordination with the U.S. if all else fails. Now, they're going to try other things. They're going to try some more diplomatic things. We know that. But it seems this is going to be what takes place at the end of the day. So the good news here, number one, uh, this is an American slash Israel joint venture here in Gaza to get rid of Hamas. The Arab nations that signed on to this have had input, but at the end of the day, it's America that's going to make the call. All right, now there's a headline here and a story from Israel Hayom. The Saudi offer to Israel and the price it will pay. And it's interesting what's going on, but we'll look at the ramifications of all this. The Saudis do not rule out reaching civil and economic agreements with Israel, but no official accession to the Abraham Accords, prompting Washington to warn against giving Hamas a veto. We'll explain what that means. And the Pentagon, as we're going to see, pushes back on giving the kingdom the same jets as Israel has. Now, why this is important for last day's Bible prophecy is that when we look at the different players, signs 9 through 11 in our book, 25 signs, we're near the end. Sign 9 is certain nations will, invade Israel in the last days. And what we've done in sign 10, we talked about certain nations that will sit it out, that will not be involved. So when we put the two together, we find that Iran, along with Turkey, will join Russia in the last days invasion of Israel. The Saudis and the Gulf states will protest. In other words, when it takes place, they're going to ask these nations, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? And the implication is they have some sort of relationship with Israel where, they're caught unaware with this and they're protesting it, but they're not getting involved militarily. Now, it's interesting if it takes a few years and they may have the military wherewithal to do something. Now they don't. Saudis can't really do anything. They've got no military, and that's what they're trying to do, build up with the F-35s and other things. So anyway, that's why this story is important, bringing the Saudis in and MBS being there yesterday with Donald Trump in Washington, D.C. All right, the Saudis, again, the inability to reach agreements on a start date for direct talks with Israel. This is regarding Saudi Arabia's normalization, has delayed the final U.S. approval of these F-35 aircrafts. In other words, not going to sell them the aircrafts until they have some type of relationship with Israel. And so they're concerned about that. The Pentagon is concerned about doing this. So that's kind of that. Now, sources in Washington, now here's what's really interesting. Despite the positive atmosphere in the talks, sources in Washington said the success in reaching agreements on Saudi investments in the U.S. and other civil matters, security issues remain unresolved and contacts on the subject will continue. In other words, we haven't got everything figured out yet. That's kind of where we're at. Regarding normalization with Israel, the Saudis presented a stubborn position, stating they would be ready to begin talks only on first of all, the full conclusion of the war. So they're not going to start talking until the war is over in Gaza. And Lord knows when that's going to happen with all the problems with Hamas, disarming and the such like, and some type of stabilization force there, some type of temporary government. And in other words, through the completion of phase B of the Donald Trump plan, they're not going to normalize until that's all done. And that's why MBS said yesterday, we're told that when he asked about normalization, he told Trump, we will, but just not now, because they want to get through all this. Now, here's the American response. They're concerned about that because it's the Saudis, what they're doing basically is giving Hamas veto power. As long as Hamas refuses to advance talks or disarm, partly due to Iranian pressure, then they're at a stalemate. So, they keep dragging this thing out. So, the one thing that Iran doesn't want, Hamas doesn't want, is any type of normalization between the Saudis and Israel, because the reason the Saudis want to normalize with Israel, among other reasons, is protection against Iran. They're afraid that if Israel is wiped out, which they won't be, we know that from Scripture, but if Israel were to be wiped out, the Saudis realize they'd be next. They're in the Middle East. That's why they have joined together with Israel on some of these projects. So anyway, Iran wants to torpedo or delay such normalization, which strengthens the regional alliance against it. So they're trying to stop all this. Now, a second demand raised by the Saudis is the full establishment of a path to establish a Palestinian state. Reports indicate that Israel, meaning Prime Minister Netanyahu, must publicly confirm his commitment regarding this clause in Donald Trump's plan and the Security Council resolution. In other words, that's there in the Security Council resolution. And they want Netanyahu to say something publicly about this. As Israel Hayom revealed, Riyadh made it clear in early contacts it could not sign on to joining the Abraham Accords and normalization with the government in its current composition. In other words, they don't like the right-wing people in the government, such as Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, wanting, more, less land for Gaza and more, Israel to take over what rightly belongs to them. All right. This concerns not only statements by these ministers of Knesset against the Palestinian state or Saudi Arabia itself, but mainly their push to expand the settlements. That's one of the things that's going on now. They want to expand the settlements there, that is Israel, in their own country. And so Netanyahu is, in between the rock and the hard place. That's why he's not saying very much publicly, because there's things going on, as we're going to see, behind the scenes. Now, the prevailing assessment, according to one Arab official, is that official talks would begin with the war's conclusion, but unofficial talks and contacts between the countries would continue and even accelerate before that due to pressure from President Trump. He says, we estimate that the acceptance of Saudi security requests, or at least most of them, will be announced then. The official returned here to the supply of advanced weapon types, including the stealth F-35 stealth aircraft. Now, here's something interesting. Regarding the issue of selling the advanced aircraft to Saudi Arabia, Israel did not object in principle, but asked the U.S. for two things. First, Israel asked to supply the Saudis with models that do not possess the most sophisticated systems available for the aircraft. In other words, they've got systems that are more sophisticated than anything out there, these stealth aircrafts. They don't want the Saudis to have it because they're afraid it'll fall in the hands of Russia and China. And so that's one reason why not. The second request is receiving specific security items and access to technologies that until now existed only in the hands of the U.S. military and were not sold to Israel. In other words, there are certain things Israel in this trade-off is getting, is certain technologies that only the U.S. has. And there is some progress here, we're told, although the entire request was not fulfilled. Now, obviously, this is top secret stuff, but this is the general idea. There's things that the U.S. can do. And then let me tell you, I've been told that Diego Garcia, that's the island out in the Pacific that is the jump off place. It's a British island where an attack on Iran would be, started from U.S. planes there and that. Our friend Nodder, who was, we've talked about him before, he works with special forces and that in the intelligence community. And he told me, he said, Don, there's things on Diego Garcia. They've got weapons that you would not believe that is, publicly or not even made. People can't even know that they exist. And the only people who can get on Diego Garcia are the military. But anyway, the point is, Israel wants a shot at some of these so they can be even more, defense oriented. So that makes sense. So, and then the article goes on to say the IDF is not concerned about the sale of F-35s to Saudi Arabia, as the Israeli qualitative edge lies in the levels of technology of the integration of the aircraft with other technologies and systems, as well as the much higher skills of the Israeli pilots. And so, bottom line, there's the weapons sale, and then there's the Palestinian state that, they're dancing between the raindrops or Israel to try and, allow this to happen. But at the same time, as we're going to see with our next headline, it's not, the Palestinian state's not going to be a reality. So let's get to that because that's one of the big worries. It's always brought up. We talk about it here. But the Palestinian state worries, as our third headline, are offset by other factors. Incorporating the pathway to Palestinian statehood framework into the Security Council's resolution. That's there, and Donald Trump's 20-point plan. But they put it some like the article says less assertive phrasing. In other words, it wasn't a big push there. It was very kind of general and not really specific. The modification accompanies Washington-Jerusalem context, concluding with Israel removing its opposition, yet receiving compensation across multiple dimensions. Israel said, okay, you can keep it in there, but we want compensation and against some of these more advanced weapons and that, and seemingly they're getting it, so they did the trade-off. Now, what's nice about this, and President Trump, before he unveiled and approved this plan in September, he met with Netanyahu, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, who has since retired, and they basically put this together. They promised, first of all, hostage repatriation. That's what's happened. They got 20 hostages back. Only got 3 left of the deceased hostages. Hamas weapons dismantlement. That hadn't happened yet. Gaza neutralization. That's still part of the plan. And that would offset the statehood pathway provision against Israeli threats. Okay, so the Americans, what they did, they leveraged the Palestinian state argument. They put it in there to pressure Turkey and Qatar into demanding Hamas accept hostage release terms. Israel's reformed at the time. But here's the interesting agreement, something that Israel Hayom has said that I hadn't seen in other websites, and it's fascinating what's going on. So here's the bottom line. The more compelling compensation what Israel's getting relates to that prospective Palestinian state, should one materialize eventually. During exchange between Trump advisor Jared Kushner, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Trump himself, Netanyahu, Dermer, and Ambassador Dr. Yehiel Leiter through the Security Council resolution drafting phases, the administration, here's the key, specified that such a state's foundational principles would conform to Donald Trump's 2020 deal of the century. Remember that. When Trump was in office the first time, they put together this deal of the century that would basically have the Palestinians have a parcel there in the Holy Land that would not basically encroach. They would Jerusalem not encroach, the security of Israel. So this is what's going on now. Specifically, a state formed solely on partial West Bank territory, partial, Judea-Samaria territory. Here's where the new state would be, resembling the blueprint. It's called cantonal division. In other words, divided into cantons like Switzerland is, or certain different areas that would be divided there in a small area, partial West Bank territory. They'd be completely demilitarized, and there would be additional provisions. Furthermore, advancing towards such a statehood should transpire exclusively following extensive, here's this, Palestinian Authority restructuring. They have to de-radicalize. Their educational curriculum has to overhaul. They have to terminate the payments to Palestinian terrorists and their relatives. And accompanying all this, they want Palestinians likewise to announce renouncement of the right to return. They've been doing that since 48. We want the right to return when Israel became a modern state for 75 years. They've been saying that. 3 or 4 generations are still designated as refugees, and there's so-called refugee camps in the Middle East. These people have been living there for 70 years. Their relatives, one generation after another, who are refugees from Israel, kicked them out. Well, Israel became the modern state in 48. They won the war there, and they've still got that issue. So the way this is framed, in other words, the way they've framed it really makes it impossible for the Palestinians to agree to this. They're not going to take the necessary steps to make this a reality. They're not going to recognize Israel's right to exist. They're not going to be satisfied with small areas in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, where they have to not be demilitarized. They have to change their curriculum, et cetera, et cetera. So, in other words, it's going to be impossible for this Palestinian state to come about. So that's what Trump and Netanyahu have concluded. And so that's why they haven't minded so much having that little phrasing in there in the agreement that the UN Security Council agreed to, because they know it's not going to become a reality. So let's summarize what we're at now, and hopefully this will make things more clear for everyone. It is the U.S., first of all, U.S. who will control any military force, the International Stabilization Force in Gaza. If they cannot put together some type of coalition with other countries, then Israel will be free to remove Hamas from power. This seems to be inevitable. Number two, while the Saudis are demanding that Israel allow for the possibility of a future Palestinian state before normalization of relations, the issues that Israel would demand with respect to their own security would effectively kill any deal. In other words, they would not agree to accept Israel's right to exist, have no military, and be limited to a small geographical area in present-day Judea and Samaria. But this reflects Donald Trump's 2020 plan for the Palestinians. And the F-35 issue will be moot if these future planes are not equipped with the same advanced technology as Israel has. Therefore, all in all, Israel still have the upper hand militarily in the Middle East. So on the surface, it doesn't look now as bad for Israel as many stories have painted, as we've talked about, in these various headlines. But we will have to wait and see what happens, because things change in the Middle East very quickly. But that's where we're at right now. And hopefully this summary has helped you appreciate where exactly the situation lies. Now, we know how it's all going to end, because the Bible tells us this. The Saudis will be not part of the last days coalition that will invade Israel. They will protest that. Russia, Iran, and Turkey will be part of that invading force. The United States is not a player in the last days. We are nowhere to be seen at that time. So a lot of things must happen to get to that place where this will occur. But it will occur in God's time. So let's not forget that. God is always right on time. He's never late, but he's never early either. He's right on time. And so we just need to look at the events and put it into perspective as we consider what Last Days Bible prophecy says. Again, our website, Educating Our World, the book 25 Signs. We're near the end. We encourage you to download it. It's a free download, as all our material is from our website, this under the heading of Bible prophecy, to take advantage of what Scripture says. I'm Don Stewart. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, as always.